Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our online event. My name is Anna Locke, and I'm chair of BrumYODO, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the BrumYODO team. Tonight, our panel will be discussing life, death, love, and loss, and how we should all start to think about death in a radically different way. Before I hand you over to our host for the evening, I'd like to give you an overview of the event. You will have noticed that we are streaming this event through YouTube, which means none of our panel can see or hear you. However, we'd love to hear your comments and questions, which you can send via YouTube comments facility. You will have to log in for this to work. Alternatively, you can use the Slido app, which is very simple. It's hashtag 853359, and we'll pick that up through the event too. If you are tweeting about the events, you can use the hashtag LifeDeathBrum and tag @BrumYODO. To let you know a little about BrumYODO, we were set up in Birmingham in 2015, and our vision is a society which talks openly and honestly about death to help us prepare for dying and loss. Since 2015, we have designed and created safe spaces for conversation through collaboration with arts organisations, community groups, individuals and the voluntary sector. And we deliver life-enhancing public events, including our annual A Matter of Life and Death festival. So this year, together with Birmingham Hippodrome, we are bringing In Memoriam, an art-based open-air installation by internationally renowned artist Luke Jerram in Birmingham for this year's festival. Presented in Aston Park in Birmingham between the 8th and the 16th of May, In Memoriam is a temporary memorial for the public to visit and remember all those who've died during COVID-19 pandemic, and also to pay tribute to NHS health and care workers who've been risking their lives during the crisis. In addition to visiting In Memoriam artwork, we're inviting people to participate in a citywide community activity to create their own individual handheld flags. And you can find information about how to make a flag, also a video explaining how to do it, and a downloadable step-by-step guide on our Make a Flag page on our website. Our other online events include panel discussions, a workshop, a death cafe, and a grief gathering. There's more information about all of this on our website, which is www.brumyodo.org.uk. So tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Diane Parkes, a BrumYODO director, who's in conversation with end-of-life doula Anna Lyons and funeral director Louise Winter about their new book. We all know how this ends. Lessons about life and living from working with death and dying. Diane is a freelance journalist who specialises in the arts. Diane has worked for regional newspapers in Southern England, Wales and the Midlands, as well as regional and national arts organisations and venues. She is head of brand and media at Birmingham's John Taylor Hospice and is currently on a sabbatical to study for an MA in creative writing. So I'll hand you over now to Diane, who will introduce her guests.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody, for attending this evening. It's really lovely that you can all be here with us. And thank you also to Anna and Louise. Just to take you through a little bit what we're going to do in the next hour and a half, I've got some questions that I've pre-prepared, which I'm going to be asking Anna and Louise. And then at some point when we've been through those questions, we'll then throw it open to yourselves. So please, if you do have questions, do put them on, send them over to us because we'd love to ask them. I'm also going to ask both Anna and Louise to read a short excerpt from their book so that we can get a flavour of what that's about in case there's anybody here who hasn't already got their copy. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about Anna and Louise. So Anna Lyons is an end-of-life doula and Louise Winter is a progressive funeral director. Together, they are the team behind Life, Death, Whatever. Their joint mission is to redesign the dialogue around death and dying, and as a result, shift people's ideas of life, living, illness, funerals, and death. Their book, which I just happen to have a copy of here, hopefully you can all see that okay. Their book, We All Know How This Ends, was published by Bloomsbury on 18th of March to great acclaim. So welcome both Anna and Louise.
Hi, thank you so much for having us.
It's a pleasure. It's lovely to see you both. Anna, can we start with you? Can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
So in 2016, Louise and I ran a big festival in Sutton House in Hackney. It's a National Trust property, and we took over the whole house for a month. And an agent, lovely lady called Lauren Gardner, came along, and she really loved what we were trying to do. We were trying to open up the conversation. So we had an art exhibition that ran throughout the house, and you walked in through birth, and it took you all through all of sort of life cycles and life stages. And she'd been to see it, and she contacted us and said, how did we feel about writing a book? And it's something that we'd both always wanted to do. We both wrote anyway. And yeah, that's how it all started, really.
I have to keep remembering to unmute. Thank you for that, Anna. Would you be happy to read us a short excerpt from the book?
Absolutely, yes. So the excerpt that I've chosen is called Why We Really Don't Want to Talk About It. Peter Bromberg, well-known speaker and philanthropist, said, "When we avoid difficult conversations, we trade short-term discomfort for long-term dysfunction. For as long as we've lived, we've died. Religions, belief systems, faiths, rituals, and traditions have all contributed to how we handle this simple fact of life. Historically, we were so much better at talking about death and dying. For example, the Victorians may have been reluctant to discuss sex, but they talked about death as part of daily life. Disease was prevalent, so living with death and dying was perfectly normal. Everyone was exposed to it from the moment they were born. No one was exempt from an early death in the Victorian era, no matter how privileged or wealthy they were. Only 40% of babies born in the 1850s would reach their 60th birthday. Less than 10% made it to their 80th. That meant that the Victorians saw a lot of dead people and attended a lot of funerals. As medicine's abilities have improved, life expectancy has increased. Today, we may well be in our 20s, 30s, or 40s without ever having to confront the reality of our mortality, see a dead person, or attend a funeral. We now expect medicine to be able to prolong our lives. Over the last 110 years, we've witnessed death on a major scale, with 2 world wars, a major flu epidemic, and now the coronavirus pandemic. During the wars, millions of people left home and never returned. Everyone knew someone who had died, yet no one was taught how to grieve or deal with the difficulty and complexity of their emotions. The severity of the trauma was minimized. Society was taught to keep calm and carry on, because in order to survive, there was no other choice. In the face of such adversity, the British became known for their unwavering fortitude, the stiff upper lip. Today, we're getting better at dealing with how we feel. As a society, we're beginning to embrace sobriety, appoint therapists, and willingly work on the quality of our lives. We go to yoga, we meditate, we eat consciously, and we talk about our mental health. Life used to be about surviving. Now it's about thriving. We want to live happy, contented, purposeful, and meaningful lives. Talking about death and dying is hard because it brings up so many difficult emotions, which most of us don't know how to manage. At school, we're not taught how to cope with the way we feel, the complexity of our emotions, and our reactions to difficult situations. We're getting better at it, but we're not there yet. Avoiding talking about death won't prevent it from happening. By changing the way we deal with our emotions, we can transform the way we approach death and dying, and perhaps live fuller and more satisfying lives. The key isn't to wait until we reach the end, it's to deal with how we feel today.
That's brilliant, thank you. What a brilliant perspective on sort of our views around death, dying and grief over the past sort of 100 or so years, which we'll come back to in the discussion later. So thank you for sharing that. Louise, if I can turn to you, would you mind telling us, can you tell us how the book then came about?
Sure. So We went through the whole process of having an agent and having to write a proposal, and we had various iterations of what we were going to write. It was quite tricky to pitch a book about death in the way that we were trying to do it, because we really didn't want to write anything that was macabre or gothic or had skulls on the front. We wanted to bring a totally different perspective and position death right next to life. So it was really important to us that it wasn't overly medical and that it wasn't inaccessible. And we really imagined it being on the shelves of Anthropology or Oliver Bonas next to the lifestyle books about yoga. We wanted to do something that people would be able to pick up and engage with without even realizing that it was a book about death, because I think the subject puts a lot of people off, and it's the sort of book that people don't know they need until after they read it and say, yes, that is exactly what I needed to read. So we almost wanted to trick people in a way to pick up the book and to engage with it, thinking, oh, this is really beautiful, this is really unusual, this is an intriguing title, what is this about? And then to find exactly what they needed. So we needed to find the right publisher for that. We needed someone who totally understood what we were trying to do, someone that would give the book the gravitas and the design that we had imagined for it. And we were really lucky that Bloomsbury were totally on board with what we wanted to do and supported us in making that happen. It's been quite a journey. It's been several years in the writing. Lots of things have changed whilst the book was being written. We had a pandemic which delayed things by a whole year and meant that the fundamentals of some of the things we were writing needed to change. But there was this moment when the books arrived. There was a knock on the door and a box of books arrived. And then I was able to put them on my shelf in my living room. And I thought, yes, okay, we did it. We managed to create a book which hopefully doesn't look like any other book about death, and it's not overly medical, and it's got the totally different kind of approach that we were trying to create.
Lovely. Well, you certainly did it, didn't you? We've all got our copies here. So would you be happy to read us an excerpt from it?
Of course, of course. So as a funeral director, I'm going to talk a little bit about funerals. And I'm going to read a section called Why Funerals Really Matter, which goes into some personal experiences as well that I have had with my own family. I'm so sorry, people often say to us. I'm just not very good at funerals. You're not supposed to be, we tell them. It's a funeral. Funerals aren't supposed to be something we're good at. Most of us have never arranged a funeral before. Some of us have never even been to a funeral. Some of us have been to a funeral where we've questioned whether it was a good reflection of the person who has died. But a funeral doesn't have to be like the ones that we've been to in the past or the ones we've seen on TV. You can create a funeral that works for you, is appropriate for the circumstances of the death, and fits the way you're grieving. When someone dies, our life changes. The enormity of the change can be huge, in many ways beyond the physical loss of the person. Funerals can serve as an acknowledgement of that enormous change and can help us to adjust to our new reality. The person who has died may be a spouse, a partner, a relative, a friend, or the person we said hello to every day at the bus stop. Whoever it is, a funeral can serve as an acknowledgement that the physical presence of that person is now gone. A funeral is a way of making the death real. It's not about perfection. It is about doing something that honors the person who has died, while also allowing the living to do what they need to do. A good funeral can be a profound and transformational experience that can help the living to accept and acknowledge that someone has died. It's not just the funeral itself that matters. It's the process of deciding what's important and meaningful, completing the paperwork, ordering the sandwiches and the sausage rolls, collecting photographs, watching old videos, coming together as family and friends to share memories and stories. The process of arranging a funeral gives us something to do at a time when we can feel like our lives are in chaos. When my granny died in February 2018, we didn't have the opportunity to acknowledge her death. Before she died, she'd seen an advertisement for something called a direct cremation, where a person is cremated with no ceremony and no one in attendance. Having attended so many formulaic funerals for her friends, she decided funerals were a waste of time and money, and insisted that she didn't want one. Like so many people of her generation, She didn't want any fuss. This meant that we didn't come together as a family when she died. It meant that life went on as normal, as though she was still sitting in her armchair in Devon, waiting for countdown, as she did her weekly shopping on her iPad. Whenever I thought of Granny, I couldn't imagine that empty chair in Devon. There had been no opportunity to come together as a family to acknowledge that she had died. There was talk of organising a memorial with her ashes, but then life got in the way. A cousin was moving house, another had a new job in America. I was busy working. Without the urgency of a dead body to deal with, the ceremony was put on the back burner, and it never happened. We never had the opportunity to acknowledge the reality of my granny's death, and this made grieving the loss of the matriarch of our family really difficult. The funeral offers the opportunity to come together as a family, friends, or community, no matter how big or small, to offer support to each other. It gives everyone in that community a space in which to share their thoughts, feelings, and memories about the person who has died. It's an opportunity to cry together, to laugh together, or just to be together, with the sadness, pain, grief, and the tragedy of the situation. It's also an opportunity to come together to learn new things about the person that has died. After a funeral, we often hear people saying, "I never knew Mum was so popular at work," or "Uncle John helped so many people at his church, yet he never talked about it." A good funeral is created with the belief that funerals are about the dead, but for the benefit of the living. A funeral can be whatever you want and need it to be. In the UK, there are no rules or laws about where it's held, who takes it, or what it should include. The most important part of a funeral is to make sure that it does what it needs to do. And a few things that are okay at a funeral. It's okay to wear black. It's okay to wear colour. It's okay to carry the coffin. It's okay to touch the coffin. It's okay to include children. It's okay to feel everything. It's okay to feel nothing. It's okay to applaud. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to smile. And it's okay to cry.
Thank you, Louise. I mean, I, for one, have been in that experience where I've been to a funeral and it's only afterwards I found out really precious things about that person who's died. And then you think, I wish I'd known that while they were alive. Just if we can sort of take a few questions then. There will be some audience members who don't actually know what life, death, whatever is. So, Louise, would you be happy to explain a bit about life, death, whatever?
Yes, so in spite of the very flippant title, it's actually quite serious. It is where the book came from. It's the name of our initiative, which is aimed at encouraging people to talk about death and dying as part of life and living. So it's very similar to BrumYODO. I think our work has run parallel over the years, and we've engaged in all sorts of projects. It began back in 2016 with the festival that Anna talked about with the National Trust, where we took over one of their Tudor houses in East London and had it for a whole month and ran a festival about death and dying. It was much more make do back then. We had no budget and we had a month's worth of events to put on, as well as all this artwork and lots of people coming to the house. We had very different reactions because some people were coming to the house to enjoy the Tudor architecture and the eclectic history of the house. And a few people were horrified when they saw a few of the death-related exhibits. So we got people talking. And our aim has always been to encourage people to have a conversation. We had lots of playful things as well. We had the coffin ball pits, which were various cardboard coffins that were full of balls that you would see in a children's playground. And we had people running in, adults as well as children, diving headfirst into the coffins, sending balls scattering everywhere, taking photos of themselves. And we also had really serious exhibits. We had people wearing headphones, laying on the floor and going through meditation about what it would be like to decompose. So the idea was it was something for everyone, depending on whether they wanted to just walk through the house and ignore death altogether, or they wanted to really engage with the subject. So that's where it all began. And over the years, we've had different projects. Probably one of my favorite things that we've ever done is called 5 Things. and that is on our Instagram account. I think we were one of the first death-related Instagram accounts, and for the first few months we had, about 5 followers, and we've now got, I think, 35,000. So we're doing quite well for quite a heavy account about a difficult subject. And on there, we often share many people's different experiences written in the form of 5 things. So people contact us to talk about their experiences, and they write 5 simple paragraphs or sentences about their learnings, their insight, their experience of whatever it is they've gone through. So sometimes we have palliative care doctors writing about the end of life and what it's like doing their role and supporting people who are dying. Sometimes we have people who are facing a life-changing event. Some people write about grief following the loss of, for example, their partner. And we come together as a community to share those experiences, to share those words, and support each other. And I think some really wonderful connections have happened. I think we may have even inspired a marriage. Someone wrote of 5 things and ended up, someone started speaking to them, and then they ended up together because they'd both been widowed, and they came together through their 5 things experiences. So we tried to get involved with coming up with ways to talk about death and dying without it having to be so macabre and so gloomy and so such a difficult conversation. I think all of our work is just based on the more we talk about death as part of life, the easier it will be when we're facing something really, really awful and we need to make difficult decisions about our care, about the kind of things we want to happen at the end of life, about calling a funeral director, about knowing what happens at a funeral. All of those become much easier if we talked about it as part of life. And that is why also we're called Life, Death, Whatever. Although it sounds flippant, it's more because life and death are really interlinked. They're kind of the same, really. Death is just the end of life. And the more that we see them as 2 things which are interlinked and stop ignoring death, I think the better all of our experiences can be.
Thank you. Really interesting. And it sort of takes me on to the next point, really. So Anna, if I could put this one to you, really. Louise has just been talking about the fact that, you were in a historic building, and yet we're trying to get people of today to talk about life, death, grief, etc. Now, if we go back in time, a lot of the information which is in your book would have been passed down through generations, or through people experiencing death, or sitting with a body, or doing the sort of tasks that we now don't necessarily do and sort of hand over to other organisations. So I wonder, how do you feel it is that sort of modern life has left us in a place where a book like yours is necessary, really?
So I think, years and years ago, death and birth would happen in the home. They were much more kind of social events rather than medical events. And over the years, we've medicalized everything, and we've sort of sterilized it, and we've taken it into hospitals. And there was a sort of revolution in birth a while ago where people were saying, hang on a minute, I'm pregnant, I'm not ill. I want to choose how I give birth. I want to choose, the environment that I'm in. I don't necessarily want to be treated as if I'm unwell and given lots of drugs. I want to take charge and be empowered to have the birth that I want. And I think in doing that, it sort of laid groundwork for us to reclaim end of life and death, and to bring that back into the home as it would have been years and years ago, because actually death doesn't need to be a medical event. We can't fix people. I think the problem is society has come to expect to be able to get better from something. And actually there are, life is finite. We are not immortal. And it's really important that we sort of reclaim that and bring death back out of the hospitals and into the homes. And one thing that COVID has done, has increased the number of people dying at home. And I think it's been sort of quite interesting how we've responded to that, because before the pandemic, a large proportion of people said that they wanted to die at home, but actually in reality, a huge amount of people were dying in hospital rather than at home.
Brilliant, thank you. And to take that point forward, I mean, Life, Death, Whatever, BrumYODO, A Matter of Life and Death, we're all here encouraging or trying to encourage people to talk about these subjects in different ways. You know, Louise, you've talked about coming at it with fun activities, with talks, with events. We've obviously got our artwork in memoriam next month. I suppose the crux of the matter, and Louise, if I can put this question to you, is why do you think it is that we find it, or some people find it so difficult to talk about death, dying, grief? Why is it so tricky?
I think it's tricky because it's always been tricky. It's sort of one of, or the life's great unknown. Unless you have a particular faith or belief, it's very unclear as to why we're here and what happens after we have died. So, and I think as we become more secular, that just has increased. Without a firm belief in the afterlife, just knowing that this life may be all there is quite a scary thing for society to deal with. And encouraging conversations about death and dying is nothing new. We are just very of the moment right now, but it's something that has happened over time. There was a happy death movement back in, I think, the 60s and the 70s that was all about getting people to engage with death. As we've already discussed, the Victorians were much better at dealing with it. And one of the main reasons was just because it was more prevalent. People grew up watching their siblings die at home. Death belonged in the community. It wasn't sanitized. It wasn't taken away out of our hands. Often people would be involved in the care. And they probably wouldn't get into their, potentially late 60s. Some of the clients that I work with are in their late 60s and they've never been to a funeral or seen a dead person. It was just everywhere. And I think in the same way that we have become a bit more sheltered from our food as well. Some children grow up not really knowing that the chicken breasts they buy from the supermarket actually come from a chicken, because it's all just there, pre-packaged, ready for us to go, very sterile. And we're really far removed from all of the things which make us very human. I think that also happens with death as well. We're just very simply removed from it. It's always going to be tricky because dealing with death means that someone we love or care about or who is important in our lives is going to die, and grief is unavoidable. Even if we talk about it, if you attend all the BrumYODO and Life, Death, Whatever events and read the book, it is still going to hurt. And some people shy away from that. Some people engage with it. But I do think that as a society, we're getting much better at dealing with it. And part of that reason is because we're dealing with mental health in a different way. The whole keep calm, carry on, very shut down, traumatized sort of thing, which happened after 2 world wars and the major flu epidemic in 1918. That's not how we're being taught to deal with our feelings anymore. We're not told to shut down and just ignore it and carry on. We're being encouraged to talk about it and prioritize our mental health and find support. A new generation is embracing sobriety. People are doing meditation. So all of these things, I think, are meaning that future generations are going to be much better at dealing with it and have some different resources. But it's always going to be tricky. It's always going to be a difficult subject to deal with, just because it's difficult to admit that one day we're not going to be here. And it's also difficult to admit that the people and things we love and care about are actually very transient and nothing is forever.
Thank you. So I suppose if we take that step forward, if we're saying that it's really important that people talk about it, however, there is a reluctance among some people to do so. Hannah, can I ask you then, how do you think we can encourage these conversations, both individually, but also societally, so that as a society, we're more comfortable or confident talking about death, dying, grief, bereavement?
I think what's really important is that we're open ourselves and that we are talking about it. We put ourselves out there. I don't think we can expect other people to talk about it if we're not open and honest about how we feel about it. I think as a society, it's really important that we bring it into education. And a couple of years ago, PSHE was made mandatory in primary schools, but it was only for sex and relationships. It didn't include death, dying and grief. And I think one of the fundamental ways that we need to move forwards is to bring that into education, so that we start them young, really. I think have we lost Diane?
We lost Diane. I think she's trying to come back.
I'm so sorry. I suddenly just lost the signal.
No problem.
Apologies. And you were doing such a wonderful job there, and I was so interested. And then the next thing I know, I got a blank screen. So apologies. Do you want to carry on from wherever you dropped out? You stopped because you obviously realised I wasn't there.
I was just talking about how I think the only way we're going to change things properly is to start from the ground and to start from bringing it into schools and teaching it.
Thank you. Sorry about that. That's the first time I've ever lost a signal halfway through, so let's hope that'll be the only time. Louise, I'm interested in terms of your role, obviously, as a funeral director. So in terms of the book, it covers such a wide area, but do you think there's a distinction in some ways that, so for example, it may be that people are more willing to talk about funerals and, for example, what song they want at their funeral than they are to talk about some of the areas that maybe Anna covers, which is more to do with the sort of process of death and dying and supporting people through that. Do you think there's a spectrum where there are certain areas that people are more comfortable speaking about and other areas where they're not? Because we're talking overall, aren't we, about death, dying, grief, as if they're all the same thing, but they're not.
Absolutely, and we've purposely written the book so it's sort of a handbook that you can dip into. It has a gold ribbon, so you can divide it. Often you can mark the section that you're interested in or the last bit that you're comfortable reading. These topics are huge, and part of the reason that I joined with Anna, who is more engaged with dying than I am, I tend to step in because someone has already died, and then I'm responsible for arranging the funeral. But part of the reason I wanted to write the book with Anna was so that we could bring all of this together and realize that it's all interconnected and have a more holistic approach to it. So the book covers everything from illness to dying itself, to what happens immediately after someone has died, to calling the funeral director, arranging the funeral and the things that may or may not be important, the grief afterwards, because actually funerals are not closure like some people think. They are much more about acknowledging what's happened and then hopefully finding a way to move forward. And also exploring mortality as part of everyday life, talking about it, how to have these conversations with children. So the book has got a lot in it, and it's designed so that people can find the bit that they're interested in or the bit that they're currently going through and hopefully empower themselves with some information. So some people may buy it, for example, because a friend is experiencing a bereavement and they want to know the best things to say to support them, how to be there to support their friend through this terrible experience, and find that actually they're really interested in the subject as a whole. I find that people engage with it very differently, and a great way into having these conversations is to talk about funeral songs and say, what song would you like playing at your funeral? Or, oh gosh, I would really not want that song at my funeral. And that can often open up a bigger conversation. But equally, I work with families who have taken a very different approach to dying. They've been very empowered over the actual process, over getting all the support, the hospice involved, and knowing what's going on, and having everyone there. And then the moment the person dies, they actually haven't thought about what happens next. Then they panic and call the first funeral director that they think of, or the first one that comes up on Google, and maybe don't have the best experience. So it is just totally different for everyone. People are triggered by very different things. Some people find funerals really traumatic and difficult because they've had terrible experiences in the past. Some people don't want to engage with someone after they have died, and they are really scared by the reality of dead people, for example. So I think it's so different for everyone. And we tried to write the book in a way that everyone can have access to information that they need at any particular time without feeling overwhelmed.
And this, I mean, I think because I did a piece on the book when it first came out, and I kind of said it's kind of everything you would ever want to know about all of these subjects, really. And it felt to me it was very much something that people would possibly read from start to finish, but also would potentially dip into at different times in their lives when they felt a need to find some of that information out. Anna, if I take that forward, can I sort of ask you, because the book's obviously been out a few weeks now, what kind of responses have you been getting to it?
We've had some really, really lovely responses. I think some of my favourite ones are where people have got in touch to tell us that the book has changed the way they've done something. They didn't realise that they could make demands, or that they could, you know, make more decisions about what their end of life or their loved one's end of life was going to be like. And so we've had a lot of people get in touch to say that they felt able to ask for things that they hadn't been able to ask for previously, and that it had been really informative and they felt really empowered by it. So that's been really lovely. I did some work at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, and one of the doctors sent me a really, really beautiful email about how much she'd enjoyed the book and how she was recommending it to her colleagues. And I think, when the medical profession let you know that it was good, that felt really, really gratifying. I felt like we'd done something right.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because throughout the book, there's a real sort of streaming, which is saying there are all these areas that you can take control and you can make decisions and you can be involved, and yet very often people are just not aware of the choices that they can make. As Anna said at the beginning, I'm head of brand and media at a hospice here in Birmingham, John Taylor, and obviously the role of a hospice is to empower families and patients and to sort of make sure that they do have the information to make those choices. But very often, before people come to the hospice, they just aren't aware of how much they can choose and how much they can, make those decisions, really. And that, I suppose, that comes back to the point that you've both made about the more we have these conversations, the more people are aware that they've got control that they don't necessarily know that they've got.
And I think it's really important to remember that 1 in 4 people don't have access to end-of-life care. So while hospice care is magnificent and it's what we would all want when we're given a life-limiting diagnosis, it's not available to everybody. So it felt really important to us that we could let people know what is available to them, what they can ask for, what they can demand. We wanted to create this whole, end of life care should be completely inclusive. It shouldn't be about, postcodes or what you can afford. And hopefully with the information that we've got in the book, you can feel more able to say, I need this, I want this, and find ways of getting it.
I'm sure by having this information and by the conversations that we're having, we are opening up people to possibilities that they may not have known about. I suppose we can't really have this conversation without talking about the past year, because obviously in terms of lockdown, but also in terms of coronavirus. So Louise, if I could put that to you, really, how do you think that those subjects, COVID-19 and its sort of impact on us all, really, have affected our narrative and our understanding of death, dying, funerals, grief, everything, really? What do you think has been the impact of that?
I think it's definitely put a spotlight on it. And actually, we launched the book the week of the anniversary of the lockdown. And there were lots of memorials going on. Death, grief, dying was very much in the media at the time. So it felt slightly strange to be, launching a book where we were saying that people don't talk about this, and they need to, because literally the whole country was talking about it that week. And I think that's had 2 effects. We have been bombarded over the last year with really horrible death rates every single day. The death toll is really scary. We have seen horrifying scenes of what's been going on in hospitals and all of the funerals that have happened. And I think for some people, that has really brought death and dying to the surface, made them have difficult conversations to think about what they might want to happen at their funeral. We have definitely noticed an increase in the number of calls about prepaid funerals, or thinking about funerals before it actually happens, because it's on people's mind. But other people have been left really traumatized, and it's done the exact opposite, and they've completely switched off and shut down and don't want to have those conversations, and they've been really overwhelmed by the daily news conferences. And I think it was back in February when it was really dark and gloomy and cold, and the death tolls were just so high and it felt so bleak. And that for some people has been really, really traumatizing and difficult. I know that so my experience has been with funerals, and we've had some very difficult situations over the last year, from when funerals were restricted down to 10 people at the very beginning, and people felt very unsupported, and it was all still very new, and everything felt very unsafe. And at the time, webcasting and live streaming wasn't particularly reliable, because the systems and the crematoria had to adapt really quickly. And we went from, hardly ever live streaming a funeral to literally every single service that happened at the crematorium all over the country being live streamed every single day. So the internet couldn't cope, basically. That's if crematoria even had internet, I have to say. Some have really had to advance technologically over the last year. And now we're at a point where we're used to the restrictions. I think people have become used to the restrictions with funerals and know that you can't have lots of people and that we have to keep things safe. But we've had more time now, so we know how to make them meaningful. We know how to make it so that everyone can still come together while safely coming apart. And I think it's hard to answer that question without mentioning Prince Philip's funeral, because that really was a work of art and perfectly followed the COVID restrictions, and I think really showed the whole country and the whole world that even making very difficult decisions with funerals and them being restricted doesn't mean that they can't be beautiful and they can't be meaningful. They can still be really incredible and really powerful, even if it is really tricky to, be sitting apart and not to be able to come together and hug and do all the things that we would normally do at a funeral.
And Anna, could I put the same question to you? Because obviously as an end-of-life doula, your role is slightly different from Louise's. I just wondered if you could sort of reflect a little bit on what you feel the impact has been of the last year.
The impact on my role has meant that it's sort of become, my role is very hands-on, and it's had to become completely hands-off. And so that's been a very strange thing to negotiate. And I've had to get used to doing everything on the phone or over the internet, which is something that it always felt really, really important to be physically present. Your presence with somebody at the end of their life felt really, really important. And so negotiating that has been very, very strange. The one thing that I think has been the hardest is to know that someone is dying alone. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were an awful lot of people. Access to hospitals was severely limited, if at all, and people were dying alone, and that has had a massive impact on people's grief. I think one of the things that can really help someone's grief is knowing that they did everything they could to be with someone, to help them, to serve them, to help look after them at the end of their life, and having to watch them die over FaceTime, I think will have repercussions for years and years to come.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it'll be a very long time before we all actually realise all of the sort of reverberations from this past year, really. Just to turn to something a bit more cheerful, you sort of refer to your book, both of you actually, as life affirming. Anna, while I've sort of got you on, can you tell me what do you mean by that in terms of a book about death, dying, funerals and grief being life affirming?
So my friend Kim, she was a palliative care nurse, and she died when she was 32 in July last year, very, very unexpectedly. And she would talk about this thing called morbid gratitude. And she said that her work with end of life and grief made her realize and feel so grateful for the little things. So she would be running up the stairs and she would think, it's amazing that I'm alive and my legs work and I can run up the stairs. And I think it's brilliant, this sort of turn of phrase of morbid gratitude. And I think by acknowledging and embracing that we are not here forever, we can begin to appreciate all of the little things that make up a life. Life isn't about the big things, it's not about the grand gestures, it's about the little things that you get to do every single day. And I think you look at it differently when you know that it's not forever. And
Louise, can I just ask you then to just take that forward a little bit more? How are you then hoping that your book will maybe, what are you hoping it will achieve for readers? I mean, you've talked very much in the book about it being life affirming and sort of aiming to make people rethink their lives as well as their deaths. So I suppose the question is, what are you sort of hoping for individual readers, but also for society?
So I really hope that people can take something from this which helps them to have a slightly better experience of whatever it is they're facing. So whether it's a terminal diagnosis or the death of someone close to them, or they're faced with arranging a funeral, I hope that they would just remember a few of the things from the book, and that will help them to have an overall, a more positive experience of what is generally a really negative, awful, traumatizing experience. I've had a really lovely situation in the last few weeks, where someone who has been listening to the audiobook version of the book appointed me to become her father's funeral director. So I've been taking care of her father whilst she's been arranging the funeral with her family. And she's read the book, she's listening to the audiobook, and she keeps telling her family things about things to do with funerals. So she's brilliant. She is encouraging the grandchildren to be involved, because at first they were really worried about the grandchildren being involved and that they shouldn't be at the funeral and that they would make noise and they might want to run out and they might not understand what's going on. And she was able to say to her family, no, that's absolutely fine. We can have the ceremony in a way where it's okay for them to be involved. They can, it's not the end of the world if they make a noise, and they can do things. They can draw pictures. They can go up to the coffin if they want to, although subject to COVID restrictions, I have to say. It's different in every crematoria. But that's so lovely, and she feels better about the experience because she understands it a bit more. She knows what to ask, she knows some of the things that can be done, and she can have overall, hopefully, a better experience of her father's funeral and put together something which is beautiful and meaningful and will help her family, and everyone who cared about him to continue with their lives, looking back, remembering what a beautiful funeral it was. So on an individual basis, if people could just take little bits from it that help them, that would be great. And as for society, I think we're part of a bigger movement. It's not just us. BrumYODO is part of that. There are lots of other different movements. There are lots of progressive funeral directors, mostly women actually, who are setting up really dynamic, interesting businesses that are really challenging things and helping people to have a better experience. And I hope that by bringing death out of the shadows and into the light, we will continue to see people becoming involved. We'll see creative approaches, just anything that helps people to have an overall better experience of what's inevitably going to happen to us and everyone that we care about.
Thank you. Now we're getting quite a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to go over to some audience questions now. Firstly, just to say we've also had quite a lot of comments from people saying how interesting they're finding the talk, which is great, and obviously down to you two rather than me. Helen has commented saying, "I'm really enjoying this talk and I've just ordered the book," which is obviously shows that people are sort of responding to what you're both saying. I've got a few questions that have coming in, but please, everybody, if you do have questions, do share them with us. As we've said, you can send them to Slido, the number is coming along the bottom, or you can put them straight into YouTube. Again, if you're commenting on Twitter, please do include the hashtag, which is LifeDeathBrum, and please tell people how interesting you're finding the talk. So let me go through some of the questions here. The first question is, what do you think medical professionals think about the book? If I put that one to Anna first, and then Louise.
I've had some really, really lovely feedback from medical professionals. I have to say I was a bit nervous about sending it out there because, neither of us are medical. But I think it felt really, really important to have a viewpoint that wasn't medical. There are a lot of medical books about end of life and about grief, and it felt really important to have one that was made up of, people who see it from a different way, from a different side, and also all of, we have so many other people's experiences running through the book. But we've had such lovely comments from them, and I know that lots of nurses and doctors have really responded well to it. In fact, we've got Catherine Mannix read the book pre-publication and gave us a really lovely quote, and she said that she thought it was really helpful, but she also wrote something for us that's in the book. And there's another great doctor called Ollie Minton, and he's got a quote in the book, and I know that he thinks that it's really worthwhile as well.
Lovely, thank you. And Louise, can I put that same question to you about medical professionals responding to the book?
As Anna said, it has been really nerve-wracking, it being out there in the world, especially from, you know, doctors, nurses, health professionals reading it, because they deal with this every single day in a very different capacity to us. One of my best friends is an A&E consultant in London, and she was a big part of the book. And actually some of the sections came from in-depth conversations with her about the experiences she has in London with particularly doctors who can often be completely traumatized, and there's no space for them to deal with it when one of their patients dies. So she talks about going out for a cigarette by the ambulances, and they've got 3 minutes before the next emergency and they dash back inside, and that's the only time that they have to give themselves to just deal with the huge emotional consequences of their patient just dying. So I hope we've written it so it's not offensive to anyone, and it's not supposed to be overly critical. It's just supposed to help everyone have a better experience. There's a doctor called Leroy Williams who wrote an amazing piece for us as well, which is aimed at medical professionals, and just giving them some basic questions to ask about remembering to find out about the person and their family and their friends, what's important to them, how they've dealt with things in the past, their favorite things, to treat them as a person and not just, you know, another patient in the hospice or hospital.
I think one of the things that really struck me when I was reading it was all those different voices in the book. I mean, you've obviously got various people sharing their own experiences in lots of different ways. I'm just going to jump in with a question here before I pick the next public questions up. Why was that, and this is to either of you really, why was that important to reflect other people's experiences and their views in the book?
Go on, Anna, do you want to say something?
I think it's so important. You know, we've silenced people for so long on how things are and how they feel. People don't feel like they've had a voice. They don't feel like they've been able to say how really difficult what they're going through is. And I also think it's important for other people to hear other people's stories, you know, just so that they can begin to be empathetic and compassionate and understand what somebody is living through, but also so they don't feel alone in their own situation. You know, we hear lots from people how they found something so relevant. They say that they could have written those words themselves about their person that was dying, and how they had felt completely alone in their thoughts and feelings until they read 5 things, and suddenly it made them feel a little bit better that someone else was going through something. I think it's helped normalize people's feelings for them, and that for us it felt really important to give people a voice.
And how did you go about sourcing all of those stories? Were they people that you already knew, or were they people that you contacted as a result of sort of starting the book writing process?
No, we started the project completely aside from the book. We'd been running a project called Unsaid, which was a postcard project where people wrote things that they wished they'd been able to say and no longer could. And one day, I think it was on a Saturday night, we were sitting around my kitchen table chatting about sort of what our next project could be. And we were saying how privileged we felt that people wrote to us and sent emails to us about their experiences. And we came up with this idea that it would be great to sort of condense those experiences and find these 5 things that people could share with us. And so we sent out some tweets about, you know, what 5 things was, and we just have had submissions ever since, and it's grown and grown from there.
Lovely, thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions about coronavirus and whether we feel that's changed our perceptions, but I feel we probably answered that earlier, unless either of you wanted to add anything else specifically along those lines. Okay. In that
I just
case,
saw a question actually about funerals and changing as a result of the pandemic, and asking if there'll be more or less direct cremations. And I think at the beginning, last year, when we first faced lockdown, that was an opportunity to dismiss funerals completely. They were really restricted, could only have 10 people. And live streaming wasn't really very up to much. It was very hit and miss. and people had really compromised situations, and it was still all very new and really frightening. And that was an opportunity for funerals to disappear forever and just for the country to embrace direct cremation. And that did not happen. People wanted to be there, even if it was in the most simple way possible, of just having 3 people there, you know, standing separately in the chapel as a song played. They wanted to be there at the final moment before the person was committed at the crematorium or at the burial ground. So yes, we have seen a lot more direct cremations, and direct cremation is becoming more and more of a thing. But also we're seeing funerals that are attended becoming more beautiful, more meaningful, more relevant, less formulaic. A lot of the big funeral directors are in trouble because they haven't been flexible, they haven't been transparent, they haven't been open about what they're doing, they've relied on the public not being interested. And now people are expecting much more. They have seen what's possible from funerals. They're asking questions. They are wanting to question the estimate and the invoice. They're not just going, or at least a lot of people are not just going with what they've been told. I think as well, live streaming funerals is going to change things. I think that is here to stay, even if all the restrictions do lift in the summer. Live streaming is going to stay because it just means that the funeral is so much more accessible from all around the world, and people who might not be able to be there, or people that maybe weren't close enough to feel like they can take a whole day off work to be at the funeral but want to, you know, watch from the office. It also means that funerals are less transient. They're not just going to disappear, and they're not this event that we just forget about, or that we are so grief-stricken that we can't really remember what happened. The evidence is going to be there recorded, and I think that's going to mean that funeral professionals are going to have to up their game and raise standards, because it will be all over YouTube, and particularly celebrants that work on templates where everything is just the same and they get the name wrong and it's not particularly creative and it's really badly done. That is going to be all over the internet for everyone to see. So I think we are going to see an increase in the standards of funerals, and the public expecting so much more from funerals.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, all the different sort of ways that this is affected. And as we said earlier, we won't even necessarily know what some of them are yet. We've got an interesting question here, so I'm going to put this to both of you, and that is, did you learn anything that surprised you when writing the book? Louise, are you happy to answer that one first?
What surprised me about, or what did I learn that was surprising when I was writing the book? Well, not writing a book is a good one. A book is a really difficult thing to do. Writing it is just beyond a full-time job, and it's very stressful, and it's a really big process to go through. I think what surprised me was how many people are affected by the issues that we were writing about. Everyone had a story, everyone had something to say, even people that seemed perfectly sort of okay and very together. When they found out we were writing a book about the subject, they had stories to tell about awful experiences they had had, or touching things that happened to them, or something that they were going through. And it was really lovely that by having this book exist and going through the process of writing it, people felt safe with sharing that with us, and that it really surprised me quite how many people are going through things.
Lovely,
I think
thank
just
you.
to echo,
yeah.
Just to echo what Louise said, the thing that struck me is how much people are living with and living through. And I think because we were writing this book and because of our Instagram page, people were sharing things with us, and I was astounded at the amount that people are carrying.
Lovely, thank you. Anna, while I've got you here, just having answered that one, there's a question here which says, do you think doctors have recommended the book to patients and their families? I wondered what your views are on that.
I know that some have. I'm sure some absolutely won't, but I know that some already have, and that's really, really gratifying. I think our senior editor, Charlotte, asked us at the beginning what we would like to see happen with the book, and I remember saying to her, if it changes how one person dies, if it makes their end of life better, I will feel like it was worth it. And we already know that it has been recommended to people, and it has already changed how people have done things. So yeah, that's I know they will, I know some won't.
Well, hopefully the more people talk about it and the more people come back saying that they found useful information in it, that will then encourage more and more people to sort of dip into it and be more ready to share, really. We've also got a question here saying, have you had any negativity towards the book or people feeling that you shouldn't have written about death? I don't know which of you wants to pick that one up first.
I don't. I have had negativity about the book, but I think, you know, that's the case with anything. And when you put something out there that people don't necessarily want to talk about or think about, you're bound to get a reaction. I don't think it's specifically been around the fact that we've written about death. I think it's that, you know, we've written about topics, lots of different topics that are difficult. They're difficult to think about and they're difficult to talk about. But I don't think it's specifically that we've written it about death. I think it's just the topic as a whole.
And Louise, did you have anything to add to that in terms of whether you've had negative responses to it?
I haven't had anything particularly negative. I mean, one of the things I've learned as an author is to be very cautious about reading comments and the reviews online, because it's just not a great thing for mental health. But yesterday, we were in the Telegraph in an article that's about funerals and grief and how things are changing. It was the cover story, actually, of the Sunday Telegraph. And I made the mistake, or was intrigued to read some of the comments on the Telegraph website. And it's interesting seeing different perspectives from the public. And one person was talking about how ridiculous it was that people need to talk about this, and all we needed is a good, strong faith and a belief, and religious funerals are just fine. They have all the answers, and it's absolutely unnecessary to be doing all of this stuff. And that shocked me a little, because most of the people I deal with don't have a faith. They are questioning all these things, and they don't have any set beliefs around it. I think we could come up against some opposition against people who do have a very firm belief in the afterlife, and that actually a power greater than us has all the answers. But so far, I think we have been quite fortunate in being shielded from any awful negativity or horrible reviews, although I'm sure that is to come.
Well, I mean, what we find is, like, when I talk to people about my job at the hospice, and people are always, depending on their own experience, they'll either come back with their own experiences of hospice care, or sometimes I'll have people say, well, that must be really difficult working there, or the age-old one, or it must be really depressing working there. And I think, you know, it's not just that the subject is can polarize people. It's also that people sometimes have preconceptions of what things are going to be and how things are going to be. So what you were just saying, Louise, about some people are like, well, this is the way that some people think. Across that sort of spectrum as well, there will be people with very different experiences, and it's sometimes getting over those preconceptions. I mean, you know, and Anna, I'm sure, would say the same, because she also works in palliative care. While it's obviously sad and it's you know, a very difficult time for families, that's not necessarily the same as being depressing, because if you're supporting and helping people, then actually there's a positive in that. And I think people are surprised sometimes when they come into a hospice and actually find people taking part in, because we have a day hospice, you know, people taking part in activities, people laughing, people telling jokes. You know, those preconceptions can be difficult to overcome sometimes. Now, we've got a question here, which I'll put to both of you, and I'm not sure which of you wants to pick it up. And it's a question from somebody called Jem, and they've said, do you talk about suicide in the book?
Yep, we do. We talk about tricky things. We haven't just, you know, written about lovely old ladies dying in, you know, their lovely farmhouse, age 101, surrounded by flowers. We've written about the really gritty stuff as well. We talked about suicide quite a lot. There are 5 things about suicide. We couldn't get into detail with lots of things because there was a lot of ground to cover, and we wanted to sort of cover most things rather than going into detail about too much about certain topics. But absolutely, we talk about it. We also have got some alternative 5 things about people who have got more unconventional situations, so that it's not just, you know, talking about the death of a partner after a 70-year relationship, which we've seen a lot of because of the Queen and Prince Philip. But, you know, talking about people who are in same-sex relationships or open relationships where a partner dies and they've really struggled with that. So we've tried to make it a book where everyone can hopefully relate to it in some way. And it's not just about the more sort of easy to deal with situations. We do go into the gritty stuff as well.
Yeah, because there's quite a bit in the book as well about child death, isn't there? You know, parents and siblings talking about their experiences and how isolating that can be, because it's not what society expects. You know, you don't expect to be the parent whose child dies, and how that can sort of sometimes isolate a parent because other people don't know what to say or how to sort of manage those conversations. And you talk about that quite a lot as well.
Yeah, we both work with out of order death a lot, and it felt really, really important to cover it because it's such a difficult thing to talk about when young people die, that lots of people don't. And we really, really wanted to get it out there and to, you know, create a discussion around it, because it can be, as all grief is, but it can be incredibly isolating.
We've got some more questions coming through, so I'm just going to come to some more here. I've got, so again, I'll put this to, I think both of you, this one. It says, how do you look after your own mental health? So Anna, do you want to pick that one up first?
It's really tricky, isn't it? We wrote a section on the book about self-care, because, you know, there's the old adage that you can't pour from an empty cup, and while that's absolutely true, it's also impossible to go on a yoga retreat every week and to, you know, do all of these things that we're told that we should do in order to feel better. For me, I take my dog for a walk every day, and I try to sleep. I think sleep feels really important and manageable. I think if I give myself too many things to do that are supposedly for my self-care, then I end up, it's sort of counterproductive. But yeah, I try to get lots of sleep and I walk my dog.
Thank you.
And for me, it's about remembering to have fun. So that was a lot easier before COVID happened, because I work all the time, because I run my own business, I have a team. There's always the accountants wanting something or something to deal with. And I take on a lot of responsibility because of the nature of the work that I do. So it's about balancing that with also having some fun and remembering what fun looks like. So that was a lot easier before the lockdowns. And it's been tricky to find ways to have fun, to balance some of the heaviness of the work. I find that structure and routine really help as well. So I always make sure I have a fridge that's got lots of food in it, and that I can, you know, eat properly, and that I'm not just getting takeaways, and that I'm connecting with people outside of work, that I'm taking time for myself. A really key one is to not look at my phone as soon as I wake up, because I got into a terrible habit of checking my emails within seconds of opening my eyes. And that meant that I was immediately subject to all of this adrenaline and cortisol running through my body, because I would know that some coffin had not arrived for a funeral or something was going on, and having to deal with it straight away. And I've learned that actually the best thing I can do in the morning is give myself some time, not look at my phone until I've had my breakfast and I'm in a different space. So all of these things I've picked up along the way, mostly because I've got it wrong, and then I've had to put something in place so that I can keep doing this work in a sustainable way.
That's a good discipline, isn't it? It's so difficult not to pick up and check your emails when you're in the middle of doing something else. We're getting loads of really great questions, so thank you, everybody. Please do keep them coming, because we're good for another 20 minutes. So the next one I've got is from Sue. Do you think having a multicultural society will help to change perspectives? I don't know which of you wants to pick that up first.
Very much so. I think we've got a huge amount to learn from different cultures, and I think the way that other people do things, we can always take things from it. And I think it's just so important to embrace and acknowledge that everybody does things differently and has different needs.
Louise, did you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely. I'm based in Southeast London, so we work with a very diverse community. People come to us with lots of different requirements for their funeral, depending on their background, culture, faith, and we work with that. And actually, we have so much to learn from other cultures, other communities who perhaps aren't as death phobic. I think the death phobia thing is a very white British kind of thing that has developed quite recently, but other cultures and other communities, which are literally here, right here in London and all over the UK, aren't as death phobic as we are. And, you know, they have a much more hands-on approach to taking care of their own dead, or having rituals, or certain things which we can learn from without appropriating. I think there's a danger of saying, oh, you know, the West is so death phobic and it's a taboo to talk about death here, and we have to look to other cultures to find our way. But I think what we really need to do is assess what we're doing and hope that we can find rituals that are meaningful to us, because clearly some of the rituals that we have are not working for us, which is why we're really keen to have these conversations and why things like Life, Death, Whatever and BrumYODO need to exist.
And interestingly, we've got a sort of continuation from that question. So, Louise, if you don't mind sort of answering this one first, I've got what lessons have, because you were touching on it a little bit then, what lessons have you learned about the needs of different cultural groups?
So I think I've learned a lot over the years being in London, over the kind of people that come to us for a funeral and what their expectations are. One thing I've learned is that a lot is not being passed down to the next generation. So people often come to us to say, oh, my parents came from a different country, you know, they have particular death rituals, but I've never learnt them. And now I'm facing the death of a parent and I don't quite know what to do. And sometimes we're the right people to help. Sometimes it's actually about referring them to a funeral director who specialises in helping that community and is very aware of all the rituals and all of the different things that need to happen. We tend to usually help people who are from more secular backgrounds and don't have a particular structure to fall back on, and are looking to create rituals themselves because they don't think that they have any. But definitely, I have really noticed that a lot is not being passed on. In the Islamic community, I went to this wonderful workshop that was run by an initiative called the Ladies of Light, and it was about teaching a younger generation all of the Islamic death rites and why particular things happen, and how to deal with the person's body and who's allowed to do particular things and what will happen at the funeral and who to call and that kind of thing. And that was really valuable because there were so many people in that community who wanted to go along with the faith of their parents and often their own faith as well, but they just didn't know how it works. They didn't know what they needed to do or who they needed to call or what was expected of them.
Which brings us to that point we were making earlier about how traditions and sort of understanding were in the past passed down through generations but aren't necessarily happening now. Anna, can I put that question to you as well, because obviously your role is different. So the question was about what lessons have you learnt about the needs of different cultural groups?
I think it's such a massive question, isn't it? The one thing I feel I've learned is just really about sensitivity and about not showing up with any agenda whatsoever. It's never about me. It's never about who I am and what I think. It's about what our clients need and what they're bringing and what serves them. And so, yeah, it's just about sort of working completely inclusively and in a needs-led way, what they want and what they need, and not, bringing my own assumptions to it.
Which is across the board, really, isn't it? It's very difficult in any conversation to put your own assumptions aside.
But you have to. I think you have to.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got an interesting question here. Do you see yourselves as, quote, death activists? Anna, seeing as you're already unmuted, do you want to pick that one up? Do you see yourself as a death activist?
I don't know. I don't know if I see myself as a death activist. I think we were talking about there's a sort of death positive movement and the idea of a good death, and I definitely don't see myself as someone who kind of really believes in the whole idea of a good death. I don't know. I like to think that we are sort of at the forefront of change, that we're trying to sort of make changes for the good. So if that makes us activists, then yes. I'm not sure that death activists is it, but maybe, who knows.
I'd like to think that we are death normalists rather than death
Yeah.
activists. We're just trying to make it sort of a normal standard thing. I think I often refer to myself as a progressive funeral director, and usually I would hate the use of the word progressive, but where funerals are concerned, it's really important because it differentiates people who are doing things a bit differently. And by differently, I mean being open and honest and putting prices online and not lying about things. The Competition and Markets Authority has spent the last few years investigating the funeral industry and mostly did not find good things. There are lots of the big players who have not behaved well. And I think part of the work that we do is bringing death into the light so that behavior like that isn't permitted anymore, and the public won't allow it, in the way that the funeral industry has got away with it for decades now, overcharging people, ripping people off, not being transparent, making out that there is this sort of awful thing going on and let me take care of that for you, madam, kind of thing, when actually it doesn't need to be like that, and it can be more out in the open. So I think where funerals are concerned, it's really important. And I probably would consider myself as a bit of an activist where funerals are concerned, because standards have been so low. Funeral directors have behaved so badly in most cases. And there's really incredible work being done by some brilliant people to stop all of that and to offer the public something that actually serves their needs. I think if this was any other industry apart from death, a lot of this would not have happened. You know, if it was, I don't know, buying washing machines or something, it just wouldn't be okay. Because it's death and it's something that people don't engage with, they don't talk about. They only have to purchase a funeral, I guess. It's a distress purchase. They're not used to it. You know, the funeral industry has got away with so much, and hopefully I'm part of a bigger change to stop that from happening and increase the public's expectations of what can be achieved with a funeral.
And just to come back on that one, Louise, in terms of a death normalist then, how far along that road do you feel that we are in terms of people normalising death and dying, and in terms of them now coming to you with ideas and knowing that the things that they can ask for? I mean, I'm guessing that over time you are seeing quite a big change in that. How far along that road do you think we are?
I think we're just at the very beginning. I think there's still a lot of change that needs to take place, and it's really reassuring that people are knowing that they can appoint an end-of-life doula, for example, or that they can choose the funeral director. They don't just have to go to the one that's local to them, and they don't have to just have a package deal of bronze, silver, or gold kind of thing. But there is still a long way to go, and I think until we educate young people about death and grief and illness, and it's on the curriculum, I think that we will always have people who are reluctant to talk about this.
Thank you. And Anna, can I put that same question to you? Because you're obviously, you know, being an end-of-life doula. I mean, I would imagine there are still people who actually don't know what an end-of-life doula is. So it might be useful if to begin with, you actually explain a little bit of what that is, but also if you sort of, how far along that road do you feel we are in terms of people sort of understanding what they can and you know, what they can ask for?
Yeah, I'm just going to put my light on as well.
I know, it's gradually getting dark.
all of a sudden it's dark. So end-of-life doulas support people practically and emotionally when they're given a life-limiting diagnosis. They also support their family and their friends. Sometimes I work with just the family and friends and don't actually work with the person who's unwell. And I find more and more I'm working to support people who are living with grief. So that's sort of what end-of-life doulas do in a nutshell. I also think we are right at the beginning of the road. I think it's really easy for people like Louise and I to think that we're further on because we surround ourselves with people who are happy to talk about it, who want to engage with it and talk about it. But I think the reality is most people still don't want to think about the fact that their lives will end or the people that they love's lives will end. And I do think absolutely it has to start with education. It has to start right from primary school. Kids love talking about death. They really do. They're fascinated by it. And we do them a massive disservice by not talking to them about it. I think one of the problems is, as adults, we project our experiences and our thoughts and feelings onto children when we have those conversations with them. So I think it's really important for us to let them explore it in their own way without sort of pushing our own agenda about what we think or the experiences that we've had on them.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, as BrumYODO, we've held events with young people and have been into schools, and we've held poetry competitions and things like that. And you're absolutely right. When you open the door to young people and they're prepared to ask the questions that some adults don't even feel that they can answer, and yet actually when you open that door, you know, young people are more than willing to, in the majority of cases. I mean, obviously there'll always be, you know, some personal reasons it may not be appropriate, but generally, you know, it's a conversation that they relish really, and you know, they're quite happy to throw any questions out there really, as long as somebody can answer them honestly, or as honestly as they can.
I think that's the thing, you know. I think it's, kids are fascinated and they want to know. And there's, you know, when you're talking to children about somebody dying, somebody that they know dying, the suggestion is that you don't really stop until they've asked all of their questions, and then they sort of self-regulate. So they tend to stop asking the questions when they feel they've got enough information. But yeah, kids are incredible. I think they've got much more resilience than we think, but we do have to be careful. You know, one child in every classroom in the UK is significantly bereaved, and so it is really important for us to tread lightly as well, and to acknowledge that, you know, children do come with their own experiences of death and grief.
So we've got about 8 minutes left, so I'm just going to at least get through another question. So this one actually is specifically for you, Anna. It's from Helen. Who would you encourage to undertake work as an end-of-life doula, and how would they start?
I think I would encourage anybody who is interested and who wants to be there to support people. And I think the place that I would start is always volunteering for a hospice. I think it's really, really important. I don't think you can get any better sort of knowledge and education from spending time in that environment, spending time with people who are living with this and through this.
Thank you. And Louise, just out of interest, can I sort of slightly change that question, but put that to you as well? Because you know, obviously, as you've said, you know, you're running your own business. I suppose the question is, if somebody was listening to this talk and is thinking, actually, I'd be quite interested in, you know, becoming a funeral director, where would they start, and what kind of skills do you think they need?
So I'd suggest the first thing that they should do is join the Good Funeral Guild. That is a collection of all of the forward-thinking funeral professionals and celebrants all over the UK, and there are a few international ones as well. And they're all in a group, having regular conversations. There are events. It's a really supportive community, sharing ideas, supporting each other. So I'd say that's a really brilliant place to start. And I think the main thing is it's about going and getting some real world experience. So whether you shadow a celebrant or you ask to spend time with a funeral director, funeral directors love to speak about their work. It's something that they often, you know, don't get asked about. So they're often very happy to have people there for a week's work experience, to see what happens behind the scenes, to go out in the private ambulance and experience it. There are very different roles within the funeral industry, whether you want to be a celebrant, that's someone who leads the service, whether you're more interested in going out at 3 a.m. and collecting the people that have died and bringing them sensitively into the mortuary, or if it's about arranging funerals and being with the family and the friends and helping make those difficult decisions and go through the paperwork. Funeral directors all work very differently as well. The bigger companies tend to work very differently to the smaller companies, where the smaller companies you're likely to be more involved in all of the roles rather than having a very defined role. But I think the best thing anyone can do who's interested in working with funerals is just to go out and get some experience. When I decided to start working in the world of funerals, I spent the summer observing funerals from the local crematorium. So I sat at the top on the balcony and I watched funerals all day, and I saw lots of different styles of funeral director. I saw families leading services, I saw vicars doing things, I saw some different religions and the rituals that were going on, and it was a really valuable experience that helped me to get to know the people who are working in the crematorium as well. I saw the way that people were dealing with grief and just how many different kinds of funerals there are. So it's tricky at the moment because of COVID, but I think as the world starts to open up again, there will be more opportunities to get involved. And I apologise, my cat is running around knocking the book over. That was just the noise of the book being knocked onto the floor.
Your cat is looking at the clock and saying, "There's only 3 minutes left. Come on, we need to go and get dinner." I think that sounds like a really good place to finish, because sadly, sort of hour and a half is up. Anna and Louise, I want to thank you both, firstly for the book, but also for then sort of talking to us about it. It's been, certainly I found it really interesting, lots to think about. We haven't been able to take up every question, I'm afraid. So thank you to everybody who sent the questions in, but we've had more than we've actually had time for. So thank you also to all of the audience for your involvement, your comments, and also for your questions.
Thank you.
Now, let me just finish off by saying thank you both to you two. Now, if you've not got your copy yet, I'm going to wave the book around. I'm not very good at getting left to right here. Let me bring it over a little bit. If you've not got your copy yet of We All Know How This Ends, when you received your link to this evening, you will have received a discount code on that book. So please, if you haven't got hold of your copy yet and want to do so, please use that discount code that we've sent you. And that way you can pick up your own copy. Just to add, this talk this evening is part of our annual A Matter of Life and Death Festival, which is brought by us, BrumYODO. We do have some other events. We'd love to see you at those. We have a How to Host a Death Cafe on the 28th of April, and we have another panel conversation, Creativity, Community and COVID, on the 10th of May. All of this ties in with In Memoriam, which, as Anna said at the beginning, is an artwork by Luke Jerram, which together with Birmingham Hippodrome, we are bringing to Birmingham, and it will be in Aston Park between the 8th and the 16th of May. The details of everything linked In Memoriam and all of our events can be found on the BrumYODO website, which is www.brumyodo.org.uk. Please go there and find out more about what we're doing. You can join our mailing list and find out more about what we're up to. It just leaves it to me to say thank you again to our audience, and also to Anna and Louise for their comments and their brilliant discussion this evening. Thank you very much.